In Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we present two works in progress from current Wilson Center public policy scholars. First up is Matt Bai. Matt is the chief political correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. He also writes the Political Times column for The Caucus, the Times political blog. He's working on a book currently titled All the Truth is Out: Gary Hart and the Week That Changed American Politics. Matt, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John. I hope that stays the title. You know,
yeah, I say currently called because I know editors have a way of changing titles.
I like it, though. I think we all like it.
It's a good title.
We're going to hold with it.
Let me talk to you about the initial idea for the book. At what point did you realize that this story represented some marking point in history where things changed?
Yeah, that's a great question, John, because it's honestly been on my mind for years and years, and I kind of kept coming back to it. You know, my entire era of political journalism, I've covered 4 presidential campaigns. And I've watched it grow increasingly difficult. I've watched the breach in trust between journalists and candidates growing increasingly large. And so I've asked myself for a long time, why is it so different from the books I read growing up when people hung out together and talked to each other and had some sort of common purpose in trying to get the public informed about ideas and what was going on. And you know, I don't think there's any one moment you can point to, but increasingly, you know, I'd also met Gary Hart and talked to him. Increasingly, I began to feel that moment really was a pivotal moment where a lot of forces in the society and in politics and in journalism collided to really begin to change the relationship between the press and politicians. And you know, what this book is about is marginally it's revisiting what I think is a really compelling and important moment in politics that has largely been forgotten. When you talk to college audiences, they have no recollection of who Gary Hart is. But it's also about, you know, really where political journalism began to change and what the impact of that was.
Since the story is somewhat forgotten, maybe we could have you do a quick recap of what happened during that week, Monkey Business and Donna Rice and all of the things that
Sure,
occurred.
yeah, and the thing you need to start with, because this is the thing that, you know, when you talk to students, they really don't have a concept of. You know, Gary Hart was once described to me years ago by a Democratic strategist in Washington as the most important politician of his generation who never became president.
Yeah.
And I think that's...
And his candidacy was hot
fair
at the time, Mr.
Well,
New Ideas.
well, this is the thing. I mean, if you go back and look at the polling, and here at the Wilson Center, we have it all bound, so actually you can go and I was able to just compile that polling. You know, he was, by early 1987, it's hard to imagine what a lock for the presidency he seemed to be, even though the election itself was 18 months or so away. He was 20 points ahead of the nearest challenger in the Democratic field, and that guy wasn't running. That was Lee Iacocca, right? He was the third place was Mario Cuomo, who also didn't run. He was double digits ahead of George H.W. Bush, who was then the sitting vice president. He was, according to the Gallup poll that year, the 3rd most admired man in America, actually, behind Ronald Reagan and the Pope. He was tied with Jesse Jackson, to be fair. And you know, so he was a major force in American politics and a very likely president. And it all unraveled in the space of a week. And it unraveled because there were all these rumors about whether he cheated on his wife. Was he a guy who had all these affairs? He'd been separated twice from his wife. And effectively, reporters from the Miami Herald, acting on a tip, went to his townhouse in Washington, hid in the bushes, hid behind their car, literally stood outside taking pictures, confronted him in an alley by his house, and ran a story about the woman who was in his townhouse, and it blew up, and within 5 days of that, he withdraws from the presidential race.
Help me, my memory is sketchy on this, I admit, but isn't there a famous moment where essentially he challenges them to...
Well, this is, you know, I'm glad you brought it up. This is a fascinating aspect of the book and of this incident, because this is the central memory that people have of this, is that Gary Hart said, follow me around, put a tail on me if you want. That's what he said. Put a tail on me on board. So and you say, well, you know, do you understand that reporters went and actually hid outside his bushes and looked in? You know, obviously the answer is, well, he told them to.
By
He said,
invitation.
put a tail on. But it wasn't, because he gave that quote to E.J. Dionne, now the columnist of the Washington Post, who had my job, essentially the New York Times Magazine. He gave that quote to E.J. for a long magazine piece, and then, as now, magazine pieces take many weeks to produce. In the interim, the Miami Herald heard this tip, decided to follow it, staked out his townhouse, and while they were doing the stakeout, which had already commenced, the magazine's advance issue comes out. And the Herald looks at it and says, hey, of course we can do this. He asked us to, and they throw it into their story. And from then on, everybody believed, and still believes, that the Herald acted on Hart's own challenge, but in fact that is just 100% inaccurate.
Very interesting. And if this was a moment where things changed, what was the previous standard? What changed?
Well, you know, for basically the entire modern era, for politics before that, the personal lives of candidates, there's a certain zone of privacy about their behavior was off limits in the media. It wasn't always, I mean, you don't want to be too categorical about that, because if it broke into the news, if it became a campaign issue, it was always news. So when Nelson Rockefeller, say, divorces his wife and marries a staffer 20 years younger than him, right, and Republicans are up in arms about it, you had to cover that. Ted Kennedy and Chappaquiddick was a story.
But people often cite John Kennedy and famous...
Right, that was more often the norm, right? Reporters didn't go looking for that. In Kennedy's case, they actually purposely turned away from it. And when it did break into public view, like in the cases I just mentioned, it wasn't really all defining. It didn't drown out the context of a career. Rockefeller came back, ultimately served as vice president. Ted Kennedy, was lionized in his death a couple of years ago, rightfully so, as a great force in American politics for a long time. So, and as a paragon of character, actually. So it was part of a person's character, their political character, but not all of it. And that, you can make an argument about whether that was better or worse. But surely the relationship between reporters and politicians was really different. And a lot of things in the society came together to change that. It's not as if Gary Hart caused this to happen. It's not as if the journalists who followed Gary Hart created this dynamic. You had Watergate, which was a huge influence, because you have now a new generation of journalists coming into the process, the boomers, who see taking down a politician as a really great prize and a really great route to success and fame. You had the celebritization in the culture. You had the end of the Cold War, which creates a real vacuum in the debate around ideas, and something has to fill that vacuum. And I think the lingering effect of Watergate and Nixon also being that people really wanted to be sure that the guy they were electing was a good person, wasn't a liar, wasn't somehow weak and deficient in character. All of this collides in 1987.
Would you also add to that perfect storm the increasing amount of media, more coverage, the emergence of cable? You have to fill the airtime.
Absolutely. Two things happen. You're exactly right. Two things happen at that exact moment. One is CNN is brand new and flyaway satellite dishes are brand new. So this is the first campaign where people can go without installing phone lines. You know about this better than I do, right? They can actually go to the scene immediately. So that blows up any story and creates a much more competitive atmosphere. The other thing it's often overlooked is fax technology. Because, before the mid-1980s or so, if the Miami Herald had run that story, it would have taken a couple of days for it to break into anybody's consciousness, right? Now you have, Hotline starts in 1987, so people can get a compendium of news. The fax technology is such, there's an article from that year in Time magazine where they talk about everybody now wants a fax machine because they're affordable and they're more reliable and you can get information around. So the effect of that is to create a much more competitive media culture.
Sitting next to you is your cell phone, and we think of Mitt Romney's 47% speech, and now there is no safe haven for these politicians.
Right.
So now what is lost in the transaction? What's the problem? Is it better that we know more about what these people are and what they're up to before we cast our ballots, or do we lose something important to the democratic process?
Well, that's a pretty worthy debate to have, and there are a lot of very esteemed and august journalists who will take a different view than I do. Having covered 4 campaigns, having grown up in this era of political journalism, I think we really did lose something. I think we really did lose perspective. I mean, ultimately, and everybody deserves some blame. I think politicians being in their bunker deserve some blame. The media deserves some blame. But now, ultimately, we're here to help people understand the worldview and the ideas and the political mettle of the people who would like to be president. And how you behave in your personal life might be a part of that character, might be something voters want to consider, but it's only a part. And we've lost all the context around people, and because we see ourselves as put here to expose the flaw in a candidate, to figure out something's wrong with you and we need to figure out what it is, and if we take you down in the process, all the better. Because we take that attitude, that sort of search and destroy attitude, we've created a situation where they really can't talk to us and we really can't get to know them. And, I think when you watch cable TV and you see all the political punditry that goes on, You know, I think sometimes voters look and they say, well, you're holding out on us because you're trying to be objective and you know more than you're saying. And the truth is actually much sadder than that. I'm here to tell you, and I've done my share of it. The truth is we don't know them well at all. We don't know more about a lot of these candidates than you could know searching the web and doing your own research, because we don't get close to them and we don't spend time with them on the record or off, and we don't have dinner and we don't play cards. And it's not simply a question of being able to talk about how they dress or how they behave or their mannerisms. It's a question of, do we understand how they think and how they've evolved as people? Do we understand how they look at the world and what they really want to achieve? And they, in turn, have really stopped advancing any kind of argument for what they would do.
Do you see a solution? Is there any way to turn back the clock, or at least to keep the good things as far as progress, but get rid of some of the things that are preventing us from getting better coverage? Or is this train left the station? Is there no turn back?
Well, I think these things always change. I don't think the train is left the station. I'm not prescriptive, because I don't know that I could offer any facile answer for that. But don't forget, we're now seeing Americans coming into the political process, not just as journalists or politicians, but as voters and as observers who've grown up with a whole new template of technology. And those voters are used to a very transparent way of life. They share everything, right? I mean, Americans now, younger Americans, there's nothing private anymore for them.
What's privacy? I don't know.
But in a sense, that might create more context because they're used to sharing so much that no one thing really defines them entirely. So it may be that people get desensitized over time. But it isn't really just a personal life or a sex life we're talking about. It really is this question I think I would pose to political journalism, which is, what is our job here? Is our job to find what's wrong with every candidate?
Every mistake.
Are you, in fact, the worst thing you've ever done? As Bob Kerrey said to me when I interviewed him last year, he said to me, none of us is the worst thing we've ever done. I thought that was a really interesting way to put it. Do we believe that these politicians are the worst thing we've ever done?
We can be very forgiving on a personal level, and certainly in evaluating our own lives and the mistakes we've made, but when it's a public figure, the distortion is extreme. This defines them in ways where it doesn't define us.
Yeah, and what is the zone of privacy? Because we want people to enter the process, and we want good, qualified people to run. And how many candidates have we lost because of the environment that's created? And is the skill set that's rewarded, is the skill set that gets someone elected, does it actually make them the best leader? If they're willing to get up and emote and apologize or just lie very effectively about what they've done in their lives, does that make them the best leader we can have? And how do we come at this with some perspective and some context? And I can't affect that change. I don't really want to. I'm not a media critic, nor am I, I'm not running a newspaper. I'm just trying to offer a perspective of someone who's been there and stepped back and tried to understand what this moment's about.
And I've saved the worst question for last, as we discussed before going on the air. When can we expect to see the book, which I look forward to reading?
Oh, that's good. I got to write it first, but I'm about halfway, and the Wilson Center's been tremendously helpful in that. It's currently on the list. Alfred A. Knopf is publishing, and it's currently on the list for the fall of 2014. So if I do my job and don't get stuck in any horrible writer's block, you got to finish it real early now. The environment is such that you got to be done a year out. But I think 2014 is a good bet.
Look forward to it, and please come back when the book is complete.
I would love to. I appreciate it.
Great.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.